Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper.
And today we have Immanuel Kant, 18th century philosopher, theorist, greatly influenced all philosophy since, man of the Enlightenment, for the Enlightenment, basically the the lover of the Enlightenment in all the ways that one can conceive of that. And we have, to go with Kant, another takedown of a faux public intellectual that we will quite enjoy raking over the coals. Is that right, Ryan?
Well, I view it as doing our civic duty. You know, we must serve public reason.
My moral intuition says that reaming him every way possible is the right thing to do. And then I have a post hoc rationalization for why that's good as a citizen. Okay. So I guess we'll keep him in suspense, shall we? Of course, they'll see the little spiel about who it is. Should we just tell them?
Yeah, I know. So we're talking about Jonathan Haidt here. We're gonna take a look at his shtick.
I want to call him Haidt instead of Haidt because then we could say it's hate on hate, just like we hate on Chait. You know, it's a fun little. But Haidt.
Haidt, as
Haidt.
I would have said hate because I mispronounce everything, but I think I saw on his own website that you say Haidt. So,
well,
he's Jonathan Haidt from now on.
Well, there's a moral intuition I have that we should respect people's own pronunciations of their names, and God, it's so boring already. All right, here we go. Immanuel Kant, my friend, he was German, as you might have guessed, and basically, besides his three critiques, was a thinker whom every subsequent major philosopher in Western philosophy had to respond to. Voluminous, systematic, and brilliant was his writing, that he was a major force. And so what we read today is an essay of his. It's a short piece called What is Enlightenment? And it kind of captures, so obviously he's a moral philosopher, he's a political philosopher, epistemology he was foundational in contributing to. But this piece is really, I think, something that helps capture for us the overall project for what would become these type of Enlightenment thinkers. And again, there's the Scottish Enlightenment with Hume, and there's variations and complexities within it, but the type that we see manifesting today in centrist liberalism, I think, is the kind that is reflected in the project and underpinning assumptions of this text.
You think so?
Let's dive right in. I think so. I think the naive, as we'll see, optimism in a certain march towards progress and a certain capacity of individual human beings through their reason to inevitably get us there if certain things happen.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So why don't you take us through this essay here, and you know what sort of his argument is.
I shall. So Kant opens up by writing in German, so translation. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, or nonage, depending on the translation. And so this opening defines what enlightenment comes to be seen as the kind of breaking free of the self-imposed ignorance and lack of development, immaturity in not developing as human beings are meant to, right? He then goes on to essentially talk about the failings morally in terms of laziness and cowardice that prevent people from having the courage, right? The courage to think for themselves, the courage to simply break free from the kind of unthinking adherence to the opinions of others that prevents the progress of what he would call public reason and the kind of coming together of awakened, courageous, autonomous intellects to rationally, through public discourse and reason, understand what is good, and that is the march towards progress, in essence. Kind of.
Yeah, so he's sort of casting his own society as just like, chained down by a bunch of irrational garbage. This is just the dross of history is an anchor chain around the neck of society, and what thinking men, of course it's men at this point, need to do is get together and have exchange reason and dual experimentation and so forth, and like break loose of the chains of history.
That's it. Yeah, and so you'll notice immediately that both the faculty of reason and the truth or wisdom that is being discerned through reason are these transcendentals, right? These things that exist above and beyond, outside of time, outside of culture, and simply waiting to be grasped and understood in this kind of progressive development that cannot be undone once it's achieved. So he says, for example, it is more nearly possible, however, for the public to enlighten itself. Indeed, if it is only given freedom, enlightenment is almost inevitable. There will always be a few independent thinkers, even among the self-appointed guardians of the multitude. Once such men have thrown off the yoke of nonage, or immaturity, they will spread about them the spirit of a reasonable appreciation of man's value and of his duty to think for himself.
Yeah, just works automatically like that. And I see this, like it obviously ties right in with his, his faith in logic and reason. I feel like is reflected in his most famous idea, the categorical imperative, which if I remember my philosophy class, it's really kind of worth going through and seeing, how this guy, who is a world historical brilliant intellect, and he's got this faith, and he like puts it to use, and he tries to say like, okay, you can correct me here, but basically, like, the categorical imperative means is that you should always do certain things, you should never do other things, because that which you can will to be a universal sort of rule across all society, that's the moral thing. Because, and you go through this like very elaborate train of reasoning, like to say otherwise would be to be like a world in which like logic and meaning itself would be senseless. And it's like it's a very like it's a very impressive sort of intellectual architecture, the structure he's built up, and at the same time, like it's kind of bullshit, like, because you can think up a very easy counterfactual, it's like you should never lie to the police or something like that, just like a very like just silly sorts of thought experiments where there's where, like, in the case where, break some rule to prevent like a huge disaster from happening and so forth. But
yeah, so still, it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to give Kant short shrift. Jonathan Haidt is no Immanuel Kant. Okay, so let's just let's just establish that this is not hate on Kant in any way. He was a brilliant philosopher with a lot to think about and influenced a lot of subsequent important philosophy. But why not talk about the categorical imperative? This moral philosophy is super interesting, and it kind of shows what you're talking about, which is an approach that is it is literally about discerning moral reasoning and the structure of what is good or bad, as if you were discerning some other universal law, right? So something that is always and everywhere applicable, and specifically, for example, the first formulation of it that you spoke of. You're right. It's about logic. It's how to put it? When you will yourself to do something, to do an action, you should, again, that's the normative piece, you should only will that you do that if universalizing that will for everyone would be logically consistent, is one way to think of it. So it could be, in other words, it could be a moral law, a universal moral law, or a categorical imperative, not a hypothetical, but a categorical imperative. Because if you willed it as an imperative for everyone, that everyone willed it, it would not undo itself. And so there is an interesting example, several that he gives. But let's say you want to lie to somebody. You want to, for some particular reason, you think in this instance, you want to kind of maybe make a promise. You want to promise, Coops, I want to borrow $100 from you, and I'll pay you back, my next paycheck, okay? And I have in my mind some good reasons for, look, I'm not going to pay him back, but I think actually, I think Coops is going to spend the money on booze otherwise, and I really want to help his health, and so I'm going to trick him into giving me some of his booze money. And that's just in my head what I'm thinking, right? If you universalize the will to promise something and then breach it, right? Logically, what happens is no one will trust anyone because no one will be upholding the promises. And the very way that I can trick you is because most people, most of the time, actually are honest and keep their promises. If people weren't keeping their promises, you couldn't take advantage of that and deceive someone, right? And so it's like literally a logical inconsistency. And what he's trying to get at is, he has, of course, an even more famous version of it, the formulation that never treat somebody as merely a means to an end, but always as an end in themselves. And then the third formulation is that essentially he's seeking this kingdom of ends where if you picture, because we have all these examples, like the Nazis come, that they're looking for the Jews, and of course you should lie, even though Kant says, no, if everyone lies, then honesty won't mean anything, and it's a problem, right? Of course, if Kant's moral philosophy works and everyone is doing this, then there won't be any fucking Nazis in the first place to worry about, right?
Yeah.
So it and in fact, if you think about it, that this rational approach to things says that like the reason we have so much trouble is everyone's thinking that their condition and their specific situation is unique and giving themselves permission to do something that is generally not good. And if people stop doing that, then everything will be better. So it's interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting, and I think that like post-Kantian type of people have tried to rescue, I think with some success. You would probably know more about this than me, but versions of the categorical imperative or similar type of reasoning that doesn't fall to like really like just blunt utilitarian attacks where you're just like, well, what if the aliens are invading and they say lie about your grandma's toenail or we're going to obliterate the entire universe or something. And like I think you can sort of build some structures around that to save it from those type of objections. I still don't buy it, but it does get more sophisticated.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think the interesting thing and the relevance for leftism, at least with respect to the Jonathan Haidt piece or book that we'll talk about, The Righteous Mind, is the kind of assumption that at the individual level, this is where, first of all, that progress is inevitable if individuals use reason, right? These are the foundations. So,
yeah.
Right. And so this ontology is totally atomistic and totally, so the tricky thing is, as we'll see with Haidt, is he's not ignoring the role of emotions or other parts of the human biology that play into things, because one might say that Kant is being, perhaps it's problematic that he thinks human beings can behave or do behave in this way, and that to be naive and think that if we just become autonomous, rational agents, we can will ourselves to be good, and that'll just create this beautiful world, right? But you can see, for example, why Kant is really the philosophical foundation for something like the United Nations. Okay, so it's a clear, clearly we see this kind of liberal human rights global world order that pictures an approach to politics and to life that that has quite a lot of faith in the ability of individual human reasoning to produce outcomes. Of course, as we know from the left, that misses a whole lot of structural factors and forces and material conditions that that are really, really important, and the ways in which individuals also come to act and think and reason and argue, not just individually but collectively, right? So, we could get to some of that, but I don't know. What I think is maybe even more important is kind of this normative goal of positing that at the individual level, throwing off the yoke of other people's authority over you and asserting your rational public, joining in public reasoning leads to ultimate freedom and the march for progress. It's kind of this, in a way, very apolitical. It basically subordinates politics to this kind of individual ethics, this individual rational ethics, and politics aren't necessary basically anymore, right? And that's where the danger is, because and that's why I think we can lead to this civility talk that not just Haidt, I really want to call him Haidt, but not just he, but these other public intellectuals, the Pinkers of the world, the Jordan Petersons,
Perry Weiss,
and the pundit class writ large. Civility, discourse, because underlying all of that is this Enlightenment belief that if we simply have procedural freedoms to discuss things like rational humans, right? All these conflicts of interest, class differences, differences of race, differences of power, none of that will matter. And freedom will just be an inevitable thing that unfolds before our very eyes, right?
Yeah. I think we'll get into that, I think, in a second. But I also want to just put like one note of historical context here. So Kant is in the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
He
died. So this is 1784. This was published.
Right. So the previous like 2 centuries of European history, and especially in Germany, were just some of the awful and most senseless wars that have ever happened. Wars that were not like, especially the 30 Years' War, which was 1618 to 1648. Yeah. Wars. Brutal. I mean, it killed like a quarter of the population of Germany, and it was about religion. It was about these sort of just weird political structures that they had at the time, and just people sort of fighting for the sake of fighting, or that they had been fighting before, and I think in that, looking from that history, which was not that long ago, and there was also, like other wars of religion in France and elsewhere during that time, you think like, geez, if we just sat down and thought about this like rational humans, we could probably avoid that sort of thing. I think that's wrong, but I think it's maybe a little bit more understandable after particularly that senseless, the 30 Years' War really had a lot of impact on this sort of the thinking of Germans, especially in the in the next 100 and 200 years after it happened. It was terrible.
I think I remember when we discussed Thomas Hobbes, right? Who really was right after all that carnage, or contemporaneous even with all that carnage. Talk about carnage, Trump. You should have seen the 17th century. But for Hobbes, because of being in the wake of all that religious violence and killing in the name of thinking you knew who the true God was, and thinking that you had access to. So this is what's interesting, to these transcendentals. Hobbes tries to really go the secular route and eliminate, have tremendous epistemological skepticism, and really, really make the purpose of, what he would call the social contract to agree not to kill each other and have peace and stability as the very foundation and goal of the political life. Now, Locke comes after him and has a little more distance from that degree of violence, and so kind of builds a slightly higher, right? So we've fallen from the ancient times with the tremendously high, lofty goals of politics being human flourishing and excellence and cultivating the good life, right? And Christianity mapped onto that, and it basically said you're pilgrimaging from the city of man to the city of God with Augustine, and you can achieve salvation. And we've with Hobbes, you kind of have this move that says let's just not kill each other in the name of God. And in so doing, makes it very, very much about justice, and the good is whatever law says it is, and let's just make the Leviathan the all-powerful adjudicator of that, et cetera, et cetera. Locke has a little distance, so he's like, you know what? How about we try to make households wealthy, and you can flourish through this, proto-capitalist notion of wealth creation and preservation, and private property is protected. When Kant comes along a little bit later, this is not that long after the Declaration of Independence. Adam Smith publishes Wealth of Nations in 1776, and there's this democratization of the individual that Hobbes really instantiates as the locus of meaning and agency. And from there, Kant is doing something slightly different, which is saying, really, the individual has all this power to self-regulate and ethically and morally kind of bypass those political means of adjudicating these matters, right? It's kind of obviously starting with the Protestant Reformation, this really you and the universe kind of situation. And it does stabilize this kind of Enlightenment, secular, separation of church and state and so forth. So that leads, of course, to this kind of whole movement towards the false idol, I think, of reason and science together, though, right?
I guess, yeah, maybe as a final thought on the Kant, I would just say that I think that his, in this essay, the kind of Enlightenment boosterism is maybe a bit more understandable, I guess was sort of what I was getting at with that, right. the note about the 30 Years' War. I think that it's a lot more of a convincing argument.
Context matters. One more way in which it's understandable, if I could just very quickly. You might have noticed in there, Ryan, his talk about public reason, where he wants to maintain the obedience and the duty to fulfill your particular civil roles, whether you're a professor, or whether you're a priest, whether you're a tax collector. Yeah. He's making this distinction at a time when basically in all those formal roles, it's quite evident that you're supposed to not go against the church. You're not supposed to make your own decision about whether people owe taxes. You're not supposed to go against what the institutions want you to do. So he's trying to make some space. He says, essentially, in your role as a pastor, you're bound to preach to your congregation, and this is a quote, in accord with the doctrines of the church, and that you were ordained on that condition. But, he writes, as a scholar, this pastor, in the position of a scholar now, indeed has the obligation to communicate to his public all his carefully examined and constructive thoughts concerning errors in the doctrine. So it's this move where he's making this private-public distinction so that there's stability and order, but you can still, in this one sphere, the public sphere, challenge authority in these ways. So that's very important, right? And leads to notions like freedom of the press and freedom of speech as fundamental to publicly reasoning about how to change those institutional structures, powers, and ways of doing things. So super important, and it does lead to kind of changes in Western civilization that we think of as libertarian good. The problem is like the March to Progress stuff and the lack of pointing out the dangers of this kind of, in a way, an idolatry of reason at the individual level, something that Rousseau really critiqued strongly, is, I think, one of the shadow sides to this kind of Enlightenment thinking that is very much problematic today. And maybe that's a good kind of transition to the good old John. I'm not going to call him Haidt or Haidt or whatever anymore. I'm going to call him good old John.
Yeah, so so Jonathan Haidt, he's a professor at New York University, I believe. Yes. Stern School of Business. He's a psychologist there. He does a lot about the psychology of morality. He's written books called The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion in 2012. So that was the one that really put him on the map, I think it's fair to say. And he also wrote another one called called The Coddling of the American Mind. So by this guy, so this one was co-written by a free speech activist named Greg Lukianoff, and also him.
How do you get all the names? You get all the names to pronounce.
Everyone's got to be named Jeff Spross from now on.
That's why we keep having Spross on. His name. It's very straightforward. It's good.
Yeah, this one has not gotten, I would say, near as much attention. I mean, the Righteous Mind was a mega bestseller. It really hit this sort of sweet spot, that lightning in a bottle type of thing that really got him all over TV. He did like a dozen TED Talks on this.
Even the hipsters are reading it in the cafes, and it makes me a little nauseated. But I'm happy that people are reading these days, but still.
Yeah. But he's very much a sort of Enlightenment leg humper, like our buddy Steven Pinker from before.
Lick spittle leg humper.
The most recent book, which is from, I think it was published this year, 2018, is all about, like, it was sort of like pitched at the campus. The moral panic over campus illiberalism.
Oh, right. That's
where like, the lefties are shutting down free speech on these campus, and it's getting so that Richard Spencer can't even give a talk at Oberlin College without someone calling him a big, stupid, poopy dumbhead.
It's outrageous. That's outrageous.
It basically is torching the First Amendment. And so that's what that book is about. But it's sort of, this one is much less. I haven't read it, but like reading the coverage and reading the reviews and what he's been saying about it. Yeah, some excerpts and so forth. It's basically just it's quite cynical in the way that it's pitched, but it's very much like it's about public reason will solve everything. Way you solve bad speech is with more speech. Like liberals are self-lobotomizing by not exposing themselves to dissenting viewpoints, and that's
nice. Yeah. Richard Spencer is just another dissenting viewpoint.
Yeah, and it's just
he has the courage. You know what? Richard Spencer has the courage to think for himself. He has the courage to break the immaturity of simply accepting liberal norms.
Yeah,
we should listen. We should listen to his important voice.
He does, and in fact, just here in D.C., two of his devoted fans, two brothers, they are named Edward Clark and another one. Hardcore neo-Nazis, Jeffrey Clark and Edward Clark. Edward Clark recently killed himself directly after the almost at the same time as the mass shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue. And Jeffrey Clark, his brother, was recently arrested by Metro DC police for allegedly plotting another mass shooting. They got him on gun charges or something like that. And so, this type of stuff about free speech, the triggered liberals, campus, like the campus snowflakes, is not, it's not really. Actually, I would say that the hardcore, like the alt-right, the very extreme right-wing sort of like soft or camouflaged fascists in this country have more or less ditched that type of rhetoric over the last even just couple of months or weeks. But over the last, like, before that, since Trump was elected in his first, like, year and a half up to that point, this type of rhetoric was very much in what they were, the way that they portrayed themselves. Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer and a lot of these other guys. It was like, oh, we're defending free speech. We're defending free speech. These campus libs, they just can't handle dissenting viewpoints. And, the sort of, I think that, like, some of the left kind of struggled to make the case against that, because, like, you had a lot of sort of feckless liberals defending that. It was like the ACLU when they defended famously the like Nazi march. At the time, it was like, I won't defend what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And, like, that's kind of a noble statement, but I think it reveals in this circumstance, like the limitations of public reason, because, a Nazi march, and I think it was like Skokie, Illinois, or something like that. That is okay insofar as it does not threaten either the safety of the community or, perhaps more importantly, the political structures of the government. So if you're talking about people who have no commitment to democracy, who do plan to exterminate huge swaths of the population, speech becomes this, like, kind of canard, especially in that they are using it to sort of termitically infest the nation and sort of like take it down from the inside.
As Corey Robin wrote about Scalia, and Scalia as the affirmative action baby, people, whether it's Scalia or Milo Yiannopoulos, they use the permissive, centrist, liberal norms of toleration and procedural freedoms and freedom of speech as a way to undo liberalism and to actually undo those freedoms by accessing power so that they can further a very illiberal right-wing agenda to oppress.
Yeah, and this is the big problem with, and where when it's like you can point to all manner of campus protests where it's like, oh, you shouldn't have pushed that person, you shouldn't have, like, taken their sign or whatever, like, this is a silly protest. Like, there are, like, several thousand colleges and universities in this country, and, like, young people are often kind of dumb, they're, like, getting their political legs and so forth. But, like,
they're barely human, as I like to say.
In this case,
very, yeah. No, my students, trust me, some of them can barely
I
function.
remember being an 18-year-old undergraduate. I was not. I was kind of stupid in some ways. That's fine. That's good. It happens to everyone. Yeah. You're still growing up, and that's good. It's a process.
It's part of your development.
But in this case, when you're looking at fascists in Charlottesville, who are sort of manipulating the mores of, like, political protests to, in the case there, like, one of them ran his car into a group of people and injured 29 people, I believe, and killed one of them. I mean,
specifically because they were protesting the fascists.
yeah.
Right?
So you scale it up, and you think, it's like, okay, fascists. Do we defeat speech with more speech? Did we defeat the Nazis with speech? No, we defeated them with bullets and the Red Army. It became a fight to the death, and that, when you. I guess that that's kind of like the extreme case of, there being a sort of political formation which is absolutely impervious to reason and only uses people's use of reason to undermine their their political groupings and their functionality, and to like put them in prison and eventually execute them without trial. It's like a grouping of it's like Kant says in this essay, he's talking about when when one does not deliberately attempt to keep men in barbarism, they will gradually work out of that condition by themselves.
Yes, that's the idea. That's the dangerous idea.
Yeah. And, if you're talking about an absolutely level sort of, a place in which there is no political sort of like ideology or argumentation of any kind, maybe, but...
Well, look, here's what it misses. It misses that you need to create like a socialist leftist vision understands that to get a certain human subjectivity, right, to develop, you need to change the material conditions. The environment has to be a certain way to give rise to that type of subjective development, right? If you have a Mad Max world of scarcity and precarity and fear, right?
Yeah.
People that want to become powerful, greedy, or even just combat that fear, as we've talked about before, or find empowerment in the spectacle of violence. They are going to act in all these terrible ways. If, however, you create the material conditions such that, right, there's not precarity, there's comfort, there's kind of maybe the feminist ethics of care operating as the superstructure because the structure has allowed, right, for more cooperative, equal ways of living. And you don't have this Mad Max kind of condition that gives rise to those qualities of being. Then, sure, right, you can have that space where people can progress in ways that we might be talking about. The problem is to think outside of that context, to think outside of the context of those material conditions, of culture, of the place politically where you're at. Is to just abstract man and human beings from their situation and circumstances and embeddedness in such a way that becomes a very dangerous, or can be a very dangerous ideology.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I guess that, the sort of take-home message I would emphasize here is that reason is a tool to achieve ends, that potentially limitless types of goals. Some of them horrible, and some of them good, but it's not going to really do anything in and of itself. And you need morality. And maybe this is a good point to like bring up Jonathan Haidt's major book, which is The Righteous Mind. This came out, almost 6 years ago. It was a sensation, and this really made his reputation among the TED Talk circuit, and
people are still talking about it, reading it, all over the place. Public intellectual top charts.
Yeah. And what he does in this book is he basically like he does a lot of he draws on a lot of like as moral psychological research to try to sort of like categorize the types of moral reactions that people have about things. And here there's a review of of his book by William Salatan, one of the lords of Slate, who is has all the same pathologies as Haidt, and he just this is the perfect summation of why this book was so popular. It says you're smart, you're liberal, you're well-informed. You think conservatives are narrow-minded. You can't understand why working-class Americans vote Republican. You figure they're being duped. You're wrong.
and I'll quote from the actual text of The Righteous Mind.
Please do.
Yes, from the conclusion. To see how sophisticated it is, the conclusion is in two parts. One is in sum, and then actually the conclusion. But in sum, quote, people don't adopt their ideologies at random, or by soaking up whatever ideas are around them. People whose genes gave them brains that get a special pleasure from novelty, variety, and diversity, while simultaneously being less sensitive to signs of threat, are predisposed, but not predetermined, to become liberals. They tend to develop certain characteristic adaptations and life narratives, and he goes on and on and on. And then he goes, once people join a political team, they get ensnared in its moral matrix. And he goes on, and this sounds so much like Jordan Peterson and basic kind of psychologizing of, explaining away any ideological differences based on actual important normative or material consequences or differences, but instead just saying, some people have certain moral intuitions because they kind of are creative types and they like diversity. And he has in the book this set of kind of universal evolutionary psychology based designations about what human beings think are moral categories, like loyalty and authority, like freedom and tyranny, and so on and so forth. And he ends up determining from his own political normative view that conservatism is more balanced in hitting on more of the moral foundations intrinsic in our Darwinian evolution. And therefore, that's why they're more successful, because people have the little synapses firing. They're like, oh, yes, that language of Trump is talking about loyalty and authority. And, oh, I hear the words freedom. And it could not be more dumb. I'm sorry. It's just like extremely, extremely reductionist and stupid.
And I would say just to drill down on the problem here, which is that he more or less makes up these various moral categories, and he gives more of them to conservatives, I think, on purpose. But setting that aside, he never justifies the moral categories in any sort of like philosophical moral framework. He just says that's what they are.
They're there. They're just there. And this is that Enlightenment kind of scientism that Pinker has, that other people have. And it's, again, both reason and science together in this way that is, above all, this kind of transcendental, empirically deduced, or I should say, discerned reality that gets to replace actual normative competition of claims and argument and philosophy. It's this way of, through science, and whether it's social psychology or whatever else, it gets to just replace actual values that come from something other than what the metrics of science tell us is good and bad. And so according to this way of looking at the human being, it seems that conservatives they hit more of the universal parts of moral intuitions, right? And so he says these things. I quote from him here. Quote, I suggested that liberals and conservatives are like yin and yang. Both are necessary elements of a healthy state of political life, as John Stuart Mill put it. Liberals are experts in care. And then he goes on with these ridiculous statements. So it's just this piece of like his picture of the world that says we're all human. We all have partial truths about what's good and bad. We're just looking from different perspectives. And if we could only understand each other better, we would realize that everything's already okay. This is, again, the Pinker thing with the way that violence is at its lowest in history. And it's a march towards, peace and stability. And shouldn't you be grateful for where we already are? This is the same thing that he's doing, which is, can't we just be civil? He literally opens the book with quoting Rodney King. Can't we all just get along? It's literally the quote he opens with. And can't we all just understand that this tug of war between liberal and conservative are just two important parts of the human psyche that are being played out, that you're just born with and are inevitable. So let's just not have too much of an argument about it.
Yeah. And this, again, to emphasize one more time, made him into an international celebrity. This sad. Absolutely fucking goofy argument. And so this raises the question of why. And I think the answer can be seen in a recent controversy over the Pod Save America guys. Have you been watching this?
I did catch a bit of that. Yeah, one of the guys they had on the pod, right?
Yeah. So the Pod Save America folks, they have a token conservative.
By the way, you want to tell some of the audience might not know the jokesters behind Pod Save America.
So these guys, I think, are like generally sort of, they're okay.
At least one of them is a literal former Obama staffer, right?
I think two of them are. So there's
two of them?
John Favreau, John Lovett, and Tommy Vitor. And then there's at least one of those Johns follows me on Twitter. So that one's good, whichever one that is.
Yeah. Good job, John. Excellent.
Anyways, they have a token conservative. And named Tim Miller. And so the New York Times published this massive article on Facebook that just on Wednesday this week. And in that article, it detailed how Facebook had hired this absolutely soulless Republican propaganda shop.
Tim. Let's call him Tim.
That's right. He worked for that company, and he helped them with this PR stuff for Facebook to conduct anti-Semitic smears of people who had criticized Facebook, specifically the Open Markets Institute, which is a Barry Lynn, Phil Longman, Matt Stoller's sort of this think tank.
So the anti-Semitic attacks were on this think tank, is what
the anti-Semitic attacks were on George Soros, basically saying that George Soros is a global puppet master of politics, that he's funded these guys, and he like gave them a little bit of money, but they get money from all over the place. So it wasn't like it was a total, like he was like it was the only person behind them. Anyways. So Ashley Feinberg wrote a thing about how this looking into this guy's career, and so he's done stuff for the NRA. He talked about how Democrats have pro-abortion pom-poms, and behind the scenes he was colluding in anti-Semitism, which, as we just discussed, has enabled the guy who shot up the
synagogue.
The synagogue. Yeah, he was absolutely obsessed with these Soros conspiracy theories, and I think that it goes to show you the appetite amongst mainstream liberals to have a conservative. The classic Robert Frost quote.
Which is misunderstood, by the way. Should we get into that? The quote is, "A liberal is a man who is too broad-minded to take his own side in an argument." Right? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that the one that's misunderstood?
I thought you were doing the Two Roads in the Wood.
No. I don't read poetry.
That's right. We got to do more poetry. But
I read a little bit.
Not for nothing, but when Frost wrote that two roads diverged in a wood and I took the one less traveled by and that has made all the difference, that is not meant to be a literal aphorism that is meant to mock the person that thinks that actually made all the difference, and it's widely misunderstood in tone. But neither here nor there.
Yeah, but I think that quote, I mean, it's a bit of a caricature, but there's definitely some truth in it, and I think it goes to show you, that like. Basically, Jonathan Haidt he's like a conservative. He's like a Bret Stephens conservative. And he built this like bullshit theory to say conservatives are better than liberals. They're more moral, they're more honest, they're more in touch with their human nature or whatever. And
he even calls himself a liberal though, but I think he's so liberal that he wants to call himself a conservative.
Bullshit. I don't believe that for a second. He's Bret Stephens conservative. And
yeah.
Like liberals ate this shit up. Who is watching TED Talks? Liberals who want to prove that they are open-minded, that they are, they are reasoned, rational Enlightenment creatures.
Yeah, that's it. And the liberals that love David Brooks, who's another conservative, actually.
Yeah.
But again, like the liberal-conservative distinction, which apparently Jonathan Haidt didn't realize because he didn't study political philosophy, is rooted in the same classical liberalism historically and philosophically. He was just blown away by this. But it was like, wow, there's this connection between John Stuart Mill and Hayek. What? He's like, these. It was funny.
Astounding.
Yeah. So, the truth is that no, more speech does not inevitably lead, right? More public reasoning does not inevitably lead to freedom. Sometimes it leads to providing ideological and rhetorical justification for fascist or anti-Semitic violence, actually. Sometimes allowing these anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists and from Trump to Milo Yiannopoulos to whomever to spout off leads to, as we talked about with, about Gramsci and about Brad Evans and Primo Levi and violence, feeds into people's narratives that make meaning of their lives in such a way that they do terrible things. And you can't easily distinguish, right, what speech is going to do that and what's not, unless you draw these important political distinctions between, which is what both, I would posit that the Haidts and the David Brooks of the world and your normal Steven Pinkers or other centrist liberal pundits don't want to do. They don't want to make normative claims, right, about the actual substance. They want to make procedural claims about democratic norms and allow the person to speak. But they don't want to say that is bad speech because it's fascist, right? And therefore we should resist it in every way possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And
so Pod Save America, it's beyond that drive to be tolerant, right? Do you think what do you think motivates, of all the people on their podcast to have on, what do you think motivates that desire to bring on this Republican douchebag?
He's just a guy they knew, I would imagine.
Just a buddy?
He's just sort of a friend, and they didn't think about it too much, and they had this compulsive need, this irrational need to have a person they could display their own reasonableness about.
Well, that to me, that suggests a type of smug, elitist, we're the heroes, and this feeds into the other critique we've had of whether it's neoliberals or centrist Democrats. The elites are going to save everyone, and you know what? It matters more that you belong to that group of people than if we slightly disagree politically. We can talk to each other, and you're worth having on the podcast because we're buddies and we're powerful, and we have the responsibility, right, to take this country in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there among not just liberals but centrists and some conservatives, there's that pining for the days of Reagan, in which he and Tip O'Neill would supposedly sit down over steak and whiskey and like figure out make some deals.
Yes.
I think that's pretty exaggerated, though. It was certainly an age in which compromise did happen.
But no, you hear stories about how, McCain and Hillary Clinton used to do shots in Poland together or whatever. And Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy were buddies.
They were.
As if like it should comfort us that our elites are basically just doing theater and their putative ideological difference in the interests they're representing don't actually matter. And what really matters is that they're all in power together being buddies. As if that should be a comforting thought, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, the best type of government is one in which the people don't have any idea who is responsible for what, where it's just like the various parties get together and sort of hash out some vague compromise, and like you can't tell like what the hell is going on. But, setting that aside, I think that, the big thing that people are missing here, and I think especially liberals like when liberals who absolutely freaked out about Tucker Carlson, who according to a reporter friend of mine, Alan Pike, a guy I know and trust, he works at Think Progress. He was there at this protest where they went to Tucker Carlson's house, and like a handful of Antifa people, like 10 people, they had like a megaphone and a tambourine, and they like went to his house, and they sort of, they were doing some chants, and they shouted at him and like knocked on his door a little bit, and then one guy went and spray painted an anarchist A symbol on his driveway, and then they left. And it was so just minor, the absolute most minor of minor stuff that even the local police were like, just get out of here. Just get out of here.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah.
Tucker Carlson lied about what happened. He said that Antifa tried to kick his door down and cracked his door. That does not appear in the police report, which Alan posted on Think Progress. Because it didn't happen. It didn't happen. They didn't, they were just trying to like basically, yell at him. They were trying to do speech at him. That's what they were doing. They were doing speech. Saying, "Hey, Tucker Carlson, fuck you. You're a white supremacist," because he is a white supremacist. And on his TV program, he whips up racist harassment of people on a daily basis, nearly, against Andrew Kaczynski of CNN on multiple occasions. He posted the address of who's that guy in Esquire? Chuck.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Is it Charles, though?
Charles
Pierce?
Charles Pierce. Yes, Charles Pierce. They got harassment and death threats. Kaczynski had to leave his house. He's done that many times. And so, I think what this shows you is the extent to which liberals have internalized and think that democratic norms are sort of the baseline ideology. Democratic Enlightenment norms are what everybody thinks are sort of like the foundations of politics, and that's not necessarily the case. You can have people who do not believe in democracy, who believe in political violence, who believe in political racism. People like Tucker Carlson, that's what they believe. They don't, they use their speech to lie about what is going on, to do morally horrible things. And
it's Lucy in the football, man. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And the way that he tricks, the number of like elite liberals, like big shot liberals. Stephen Colbert was defending Tucker over this. Probably 2-3 dozen other people. It demonstrates, I think, how liberals like almost can't conceive of an ideological opponent who does not believe in the Enlightenment, who thinks that the Enlightenment is garbage.
But they also must subconsciously already believe that basically the biggest problem we have is civility. They must also be totally blind to the daily violence that the state and, basically neoliberalism is killing and harming and violently terrorizing people through our military, through our police, through our devastating way of allocating resources and taking away people's homes, their food, any number of daily violences that so many people have to suffer are totally ignored, because if they weren't, you wouldn't think that some person being yelled at, right, in front of his home, who is perpetuating, not just inspiring certain crazy lunatics to shoot up a synagogue, but holding on to the status quo that will prevent the radical change needed to help all those people, all the black bodies that are being shot and thrown in prison, all of the people that the status quo harms. Like, we always think of what happens when change disrupts, if it makes a newscaster uncomfortable or what have you, or if Antifa does something, there's a little property damage, a little scuffle with the actual fascists. Oh no, that's bad. Well, what are they trying to do? They're trying to disrupt a status quo which is always already violent nationally, locally, globally, and is so terrible, except that the people in power don't feel it or see it. And so they aren't disturbed. They think there's a peace that is reigning. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem of the liberal proceduralism.
Yeah. Yeah, and it totally, I mean, I'm sure you remember this in the 2016 election when somebody burned down the headquarters of the North Carolina Republican Party.
Fundraising, baby.
And they a bunch of liberals went around passing the hat, to donate money to the Republican Party, not with any kind of strings attached. They're just like, "Oh, we're going to replace this for you."
Yes, it's a nice symbolic gesture.
Yeah.
As if the funding of the Republican agenda didn't actually kill and harm lives.
Yeah. Yeah, and it you see what you could sort of see what they're thinking. This would be maybe you could say
going back to Kant, maybe, actually, if everyone acted this way, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this ties us back to Kant. If everyone simply acted this way, everything would be okay.
We set an example. If we set an example, we convince people, we pretend as though it's the mid-1950s and there's this sort of suffocating blanket of conformity to where this kind of thing is just absolutely beyond the pale, then things will be better. But they didn't realize what would actually happen, and what would actually happen in North Carolina in particular. Which was the whole state party was involved with just basically systematically trying to steal the election, trying to suborn the Supreme Court at the time, and acting with utter contempt for anything you might call democratic values, the norms of the Enlightenment, any kind of fair play or turnabout or respect for the things that you do. And it's it's something I come back to again and again, Americans think that the United States won the Second World War. And all of our movies, our TV shows, our sort of national mythology. I think you could say that America was very important in winning the Second World War, but the people who won the Second World War were the communists. They were the Red Army.
Absolutely.
The Red Army won the Second World War. That was 3/4 of the Second World War was an absolute slugfest bloodbath in Eastern Europe. Could the U.S. have beaten them, the actual German army, from a standing start without any, the Red Army taking out 3/4 of the German military before they did any invasion? Not confident.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think certainly kind of this atomistic liberal vision, whether it's Locke or Kant, of political community as these, individuated actors who are just operating from self-interest and in terms of Locke's economic being, and then Kant's kind of rational, autonomous agent. Are these the people that will understand and oppose the illiberal, fevered passion of a narrative of anti-Semitism or fascism, or the kind of narratives and meaning making that inspires and inflames the passions to sacrifice, right, like the kamikazes did, to sacrifice and go to all-out war as a means of supplying meaning. And so, it's hard to rationally dissuade somebody from that kind of affect-laden way of making meaning of their purpose in the world. And so if you think that you can convince anyone other than just another Enlightenment liberal that way, then you don't understand the theater in which you're engaged.
Yeah, and this, it's just a kind of a fighting spirit, and I guess as a closing comment, you Jonathan Haidt got all this respectful attention from entirely liberals. Conservatives do not care at all about what he says. It's like a few of the more intellectual ones like glommed onto his stuff as being like validating their politics. But you look today, and is there any way you could ever possibly justify the idea that conservatives are more moral than liberals? Republicans are standing absolutely lockstep, with the exception of about 10 people in D.C., behind this odious, racist troglodyte of a president who just, he made excuses for the fascists at Charlottesville. His his enthusiastic supporters have. One of them was recently arrested, as we said, in D.C. The other, the MAGA bomber, sent a bunch of bombs to Democratic politicians. He is keeping children in tent cities, basically Boer War style concentration camps. And the whole entire everything about Republican rule is terrible. They're just awful people. And I defy any psychologist in this country to defend this fucking Republican Party. To give me a sort of, maybe we'll talk about Carl Schmitt in the next episode, but give me like an open fascist who's just like, it's fine to murder tens of thousands of people, in preference to this sort of muling, sort of brand obsessed TED Talk guy who's just like, well, yeah, conservatives have super heightened, they love authority, and they're very triggered by disgust, and that's good because I said it is.
Yeah, and so the Jonathan Haidt's, damn it, man, I don't know how to pronounce his name either. They are doing the work that we talked about in the Gramsci episode of basically brainwashing all the people we need to be on board to fight the evil into perpetuating the evil through accommodation and toleration and the total blindness to the threat.
Yeah.
So he's just serving those ends and serving right smack into the interests of the powerful and the evil. So that's why we're attacking the Pinkers, the Haidts, and all these public intellectuals, because they reach so many people, right? Liberals whom we need to radicalize. And those are the people that need to wake up, right? They already know that Trump is terrible, but it's not because he's incivil. Okay. And other Republicans are terrible too. And you need to just wake up and get on board with the political fight.
Amen.
That is some righteous anger in response to the bullshit righteous mind nonsense. Okay. All right. I think that's
yeah, that's a good place to stop.
Good.
We're over time.
All right.
But we will see everyone next week.
Bye-bye.
Adios.